In 1933, a man stood in front of a crowd of 700,000 people. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a general. He was a failed art student from Austria who had spent years homeless, sleeping in shelters. And yet, those 700,000 people screamed his name, they wept, they raised their arms, they would go on to do things that historians still struggle to explain. So here is the question I want to sit with right at the start of this video. Those 700,000 people, were they monsters? Or were they just ordinary people who had been taken somewhere they never planned to go? Because I have been going deep into the history of propaganda, and what I found genuinely unsettled me, not because of the tyrants who used it, but because of what it reveals about all of us. I want to be honest with you from the start. I am not a historian. I am not a psychologist. What I am is someone who got curious about something and couldn't stop pulling the thread. It started with a simple question. How do ordinary, reasonable people end up believing things that just a few years earlier they would have found completely unacceptable? Not just believing those things quietly, defending them, spreading them, fighting for them. We tend to answer that question by pointing at the leaders, Hitler, Stalin, the architects of Rwanda, and yes, those people were real, and their choices were catastrophic. But that explanation has always felt incomplete to me, because it skips over the mechanism, the actual machinery that gets from point A to point B, from a normal society to one that has turned on itself. That machinery has a name. It is called propaganda. And I want to show you how it actually works, not as a history lesson, but as a mirror. World War I, 1914. Most people think of propaganda as obvious lies, posters with ridiculous slogans, cartoons of enemies, something you'd spot immediately and roll your eyes at. And honestly, that is exactly what propagandists want you to think, because the most effective propaganda in history wasn't the stuff that looked like propaganda, it was the stuff that felt like common sense, like patriotism, like belonging, like the obvious truth that everyone around you already believed. When Britain entered the war in 1914, they had a problem. Their army was voluntary, they needed men, millions of them, and they needed those men to want to go. So they built a machine. The British War Propaganda Bureau recruited the most celebrated writers of the era, authors people already trusted, Arthur Conan Doyle, Rudyard Kipling, H.G. Wells. These weren't government spokesmen, they were beloved cultural figures, and they wrote pamphlets, essays, stories that framed the war as a moral duty. But the real engine was the poster, Lord Kitchener, pointing directly at you. Your country needs you, not needs soldiers, needs you, specifically, personally. That single design choice, the direct gaze, the finger, the second person address, was completely deliberate. It made every man who saw it feel individually summoned. Now here's where I want to slow down, because it's easy to watch this from a distance and think, surely people saw through it, surely they knew they were being manipulated. Some did, but most didn't, and the reason comes down to something fundamental about how human psychology actually works. When you are emotionally activated, when you feel fear, or anger, or pride, your ability to think critically drops significantly. Psychologists call this the affect heuristic. When something makes you feel strongly, You start evaluating it based on the feeling, not the facts. The posters weren't asking you to analyze the war, they were making you feel something about it first. And once you felt it, the analysis never really happened. This is the first tool of propaganda, emotion before reason. And they paired it with something even more powerful, repetition. The same images, the same phrases, the same framing. Over and over. Until it didn't feel like something you were being told. It felt like something you already knew. By the end of the war, over 700,000 British men had died. Many of them had volunteered. Nazi Germany, 1933-1945. If World War I built the engine, Nazi Germany turbocharged it. Joseph Goebbels was appointed Reich Minister of Propaganda in 1933. He was 35 years old, and he understood something that most politicians before him had missed. You don't win people over with arguments, you win them over with feelings and identity. Goebbels didn't just want Germans to support the Nazi Party, he wanted them to become a different kind of person, someone whose entire sense of self but anti-distinct identity was wrapped up in the movement. So how do you do that? The Nuremberg rallies. This is one of the most studied examples of mass psychology in history. These weren't political events, they were theater, carefully choreographed, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in precise formations, torches, synchronized movement, music that built, and built. Hitler didn't appear until the tension was almost unbearable. Then he arrived to an explosion of sound and light that felt almost supernatural. People described it as a religious experience, and that language is important because what Goebbels was engineering was something that functioned like a religious conversion, a feeling of transcendence, of being part of something larger and more meaningful than yourself. But the rallies were just one piece. There was radio. In 1933, the Nazis introduced the Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, a cheap radio set, affordable for almost any German household. By 1939, over 70% of German homes had one. And what did they broadcast? Hitler's speeches, Nazi music, news presented through a very specific frame over and over, every day, in every home. There were the youth organizations. The Hitler Youth enrolled children from the age of 10, not to teach them politics explicitly, but to give them community, adventure, belonging, physical challenge, friendship, all the things a child wants, and wrapped around all of it was an identity. You are German, you are special, you are part of something historic. By the time those children were adults, the worldview wasn't something they'd been told, it was something they'd grown up inside of. It was them. And then there was the scapegoat. I want to spend a moment on this because it is the part I find most disturbing and the most important to understand. Every major propaganda campaign in history has identified an enemy, not just a political opponent, an existential threat, something that explains everything that has gone wrong and must be eliminated for things to go right. For the Nazis, that was Jewish people, and the campaign against them didn't start with violence, it started with words. First, newspaper cartoons, caricatures, then signage, then laws that separated Jewish Germans from the rest of society. Each step normalized the next. Each step made the previously unthinkable slightly more thinkable. Psychologists call this the foot in the door technique. Get someone to agree to something small, then something slightly bigger. The commitment grows, the identity shifts, and the person who started by tolerating a cartoon ends up somewhere they would never have gone. In a single step. Germany in the early 1930s was a country in crisis. humiliated by World War I, destroyed by economic collapse. People were frightened and angry and looking for an explanation. Propaganda gave them one: simple, clear, someone to blame, someone to fight. And that felt to millions of people like relief. The Cold War, 1947-1991. Now I want to introduce a complication, because when most people think about propaganda, they think about the Soviets or the Nazis, something over there, something that happened to other people. But here is what is interesting. During the Cold War, both sides ran propaganda operations on their own citizens simultaneously, and both were convinced they were telling the truth. In the Soviet Union, the state controlled every newspaper, every film studio, every school curriculum. Citizens were taught from birth that capitalism was exploitation, that America was an aggressor, and in the United States, films were produced with CIA involvement. School children practiced nuclear drills under their desks. The word communist became so loaded that simply attaching it to a person was enough to end them, socially, professionally. Both populations were scared. Both populations believed their fear was rational. Both populations were largely unaware of how comprehensively their media environment had been shaped. Today, at this point in the video, you might be thinking, okay, but that was then. We have the internet now. We have access to every perspective. Surely propaganda is less effective in an information-rich world. I am going to push back on that, gently but firmly. Because I think the internet hasn't weakened propaganda. I think it has created something more powerful than anything Goebbels could have imagined. And the reason is the recommendation algorithm. Every major platform, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, has one job: keep you on the platform as long as possible. And the data is very clear on what keeps people engaged: outrage, fear, content that triggers a strong emotional response. In 2016, researchers at MIT published a study on how misinformation spreads on social media. They found that false news stories spread faster, reached more people, and penetrated more deeply into networks than true ones. Why? Because false stories tended to be more emotionally novel, more surprising, more outrage-inducing. The algorithm didn't prefer them because they were false. It preferred them because they were engaging. Sound familiar? Why it works. So let me pull this all together. Propaganda works across every era, every culture, every technology, because it exploits specific, predictable features of human psychology. First, we are emotional before we are rational. Our feelings about something arrive before our analysis of it, and those feelings shape the analysis more than we realize. Second, we need to belong. Tribal identity is not a flaw in human nature. It is one of the things that allowed us to survive for thousands of years. But it means we are deeply susceptible to messages that tell us who our group is and who the threat to our group is. Third, fear is a short circuit. When we are frightened, we become more obedient, more accepting of authority, more willing to surrender rights and freedoms in exchange for a promise of safety. Fourth, repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates truth. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect. If you hear something often enough, it starts to feel true, regardless of whether it is. And fifth, and this is the one I find hardest to sit with, ordinary people don't become capable of terrible things overnight. They move incrementally, each step justified by the last, each step making the next one slightly more possible. The slow normalization of the previously unthinkable. The 700,000 people at Nuremberg were not monsters when they arrived. They became capable of monstrous things. Through a process, a carefully engineered process that took years and G'd and tin and touched every part of their lives. So, where does that leave us? I am not going to stand here and tell you that you are being manipulated right now, partly because I genuinely don't know your specific situation, and partly because that kind of message is itself a rhetorical technique, and I would rather not use the tools I have just spent 20 minutes describing. What I will say is this: understanding propaganda does not make you immune to it. The psychologists who study these mechanisms are just as susceptible to fear and tribalism and confirmation bias as anyone else. That is the whole point. It operates below the level of conscious awareness, but understanding it does give you something. A pause, a moment where, before you feel the anger, or the fear, or the certainty, you can ask, where is this coming from? Who does it benefit? What am I being asked to feel and why? Not cynicism, not the exhausting refusal to believe anything, just a question. The German philosopher Theodor Adorno spent his life studying how propaganda had transformed his country, and he came to a conclusion that has stayed with me. He said that the task of real education is not to fill people with knowledge. It is to teach people how to think for themselves so completely that no authority can think for them. That is harder than it sounds, maybe the hardest thing there is. Who decides what you should be afraid of? If this video made you think or made you uncomfortable in a productive way, I would genuinely like to know what you took from it. Drop it in the comments, and if you want to go deeper, the next video in this series looks at why humans seem almost hardwired to create enemies. The psychology of us versus them, and what history tells us about where that leads. I will see you there.